The others cast themselves down upon the fragrant grass, but Frodo stood a while, still lost in wonder. It seemed to him that he had stepped through a high window that looked out on a vanished world. A light was upon it for which his language had no name. All that he saw was shapely, but the shapes seemed at once clear-cut, as if they had been first conceived and drawn at the uncovering of his eyes, and ancient as if they had endured forever. He saw no color but those he knew, gold and white and blue and green, but they were fresh and poignant, as if he had at that moment first perceived them and made for them names new and wonderful. In winter here no heart could mourn for summer or for spring. No blemish or sickness or deformity could be seen in anything that grew upon the earth. On the land of Lorien there was no stain. Hello everybody, welcome to Aude and Tulava, where we are walking our way through Tolkien's Legendarium. Today we're finishing up chapter 6 of book 2, Lothlorien. Don't forget, I do have a couple of my favorite versions of the book at different price points linked in the description. And of course, memberships are open where you get early access to videos and member-only posts if you'd like to help out the channel either way. All right, let's dive in. We left off last week with Legolas and Frodo climbing into a tree to speak with these seemingly friendly elves. Sam follows, obviously, and after one of the elves speaks in Elvish to them, we get some better hospitality. "Welcome," the elf then said again in the common language, speaking slowly. "We seldom use any tongue but our own, for we dwell now in the heart of the forest, and do not willingly have dealings with any other folk. Even our own kindred in the north are sundered from us, but there are some of us still who go abroad for the gathering of news and the watching of our enemies, and they speak the languages of other lands. I am one, Haldir is my name. My brothers, Rumil and Orphan, speak little of your tongue." And I think this gives us a pretty interesting view of the elves of Lothlorien. They're essentially isolationists. Most don't bother to learn the language of the peoples around them. I guess it makes sense, at least a little bit. They're on the east side of the Misty Mountains, and if you go to the right spot in Lothlorien, you'll be able to actually see Dol Guldur, where Sauron stayed for a while and then gave to the Nazgul. But aside from that, we don't have to look too deep to see why they isolate themselves so much. For one, the ring of power Galadhrim wears, Nenya, is not about power and domination, it's about preservation. Along with its partners, the three were made to make the things the elves love last longer. For another, we have to look at Galadriel's life in the First Age. Galadriel spent a lot of time in Doriath, learning from Melian. Doriath is even where she met Celeborn, but she learned a lot from Melian, probably including her defensive strategy. Melian put a magical maze around Doriath that kept people out. The elves there fought against Morgoth, some, but they were never really en masse. More like kind of small sorties. As powerful as Galadriel is, she isn't on the same level as Melian, who was a Maya. But she does have her ring, which augments her power. So instead of a magical maze, she uses her people to create a barrier around the forest. If orcs come in, they don't get back out, so they can't tell anyone else about what's in the forest. Thus, Lothlorien becomes a place of dread for evil creatures. Now, it's not crazy to learn the elves of Lothlorien received word from Elrond's messengers as they were on their way home up the Dimril Stair. They're walking literally right past Lothlorien. But I guess they had not known who was in the company before they left Rivendell. Why do I bring that up? Well, when the Lorien elves ask how many are in the company, we get Legolas's response. 8, said Legolas, myself, 4 hobbits, and 2 men, one of whom, Aragorn, is an elf friend of the folk of Westerness. The name of Aragorn, son of Arathorn, is known in Lorien, said Haldir, and he has the favor of the lady. All then as well. But you have yet spoken only of 7. The 8th is a dwarf, said Legolas. A dwarf, said Haldir. That is not well. We have not had dealings with the dwarves since the dark days. They are not permitted in our land. I cannot allow them to pass. So I have a question for you all. Was Legolas ashamed to be traveling with a dwarf? Or was he just kind of reluctant to bring it up to the elves of Lothlorien because he knew how they would react? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Personally, I think he was just trying to kind of just let it fly under the radar. Just not mention it, hope they don't notice, and, politely ignore Gimli the way he's honestly kind of been doing the whole trip. Just, it's just easier that way. Haldir decides then the sleeping arrangement and leaves the dwarf problem for another day. The 4 hobbits shall climb up here and stay with us. We do not fear them. There is another talon in the next tree. There the others must take refuge. You, Legolas, must answer to us for them. Call us if anything is amiss, and have an eye on that dwarf. So I guess they fear the dwarves? And we'll get into this more a little bit later in the video, but first we get a little bit of hobbitry. It's not quite as obvious as it gets some other times, but I really like it when Sam gets involved, besides being the butt of the joke. Pippin went on talking for a while. "I hope if I do go to sleep in this bird loft that I shan't roll off," he said. "Once I do get to sleep," said Sam, "I shall go on sleeping, whether I roll off or no. And the less said, the sooner I'll drop off, if you take my meaning." I'm sure many of us have been at a sleepover or something, and it's really time to just go to sleep. But that one friend just keeps going. Here, that's Pippin, and Sam is just the guy trying to get some sleep after a long couple of weeks. I've been either. I've been both at some point. Orcs pass by in the night, and we see Sting used in Frodo's fashion to see where they are or if they're far enough off for the blade to stop glinting. But while he's awake and keeping an eye on his sword, we get our first real glimpse of Gollum. Then he heard faintly a sound like sniffing, and something seemed to be scrabbling on the bark of the tree trunk. He stared down into the dark, holding his breath. Something was now climbing slowly, and its breath came like a soft hissing through closed teeth. Then coming up, close to the stem, Frodo saw two pale eyes. They stopped and gazed upward, unwinking. Suddenly they turned away, and a shadowy figure slipped around the trunk of the tree and vanished. All the other times we've seen Gollum is mostly just Frodo hearing footsteps, or that one time in Moria when he saw eyes. But here we get a much better idea of the creature following them. The hissing through the teeth sure feels like Gollum. I've always wondered why, even though he explains why, Haldir didn't shoot Gollum at that point. But it's just another one of those small things that kind of had to go right for, everything to happen the right way. Gollum plays a pretty big part. And this is the first time we really see Tolkien bemoan the ruining of nature. Gandalf mentions it in the Council of Elrond a little when he talks about Isengard, but it was never quite as strong as Haldir here. They crossed the Nimrodel, cursed their foul feet in its clean water, and went on down the old road beside the river. Every other time we've seen Tolkien kind of wax poetic about nature, it's just really in his descriptions. But we'll see more and more, his love for nature kind of coming out. But it's no secret he hated what was happening to the world around him. And the more I learn about him, it makes sense. One, he grew up in a pretty, call it idyllic place in Cirhol, and his young adult life was pretty much filled with seeing the damage and death technology foisted on the world. Two, his area of focus and expertise was all ancient stuff. He wasn't a linguist, he was a philologist. He studied ancient languages and even hypothesized about what even more ancient languages looked like or sounded like, based on how words evolved. I don't really fully understand it, but I'm just saying he was focused on, and dare I say, obsessed with old tales of heroes before technology. It's just really starting to make sense for me. Now, as the company crosses the Celebrant, we learn more about Lorien and how the company are to proceed to seek Galadhrim. "Now, friends," said Haldir, "you have entered the Nath of Lorien, or the Gore, as you would say, for it is the land that lies like a spearhead between the arms of Silverlode and Anduin the Great. We allow no strangers to spy out the secrets of the Nath. Few indeed are permitted even to set foot here. As was agreed, I shall here blindfold the eyes of Gimli the dwarf. The others may walk free for a while until we come near to our dwellings down in Elgaldil, in the angle between the rivers." Before we enter the discussion about the blindfolding, let's talk briefly about the word Nath. Hammond and Skull let us know Nath means triangle. And in the Treason of Isengard, which is volume 7 of the History of Middle-earth, it says this: Old English gara, in modern use a wedge-shaped piece of cloth, but in Old English an angular point of land, was related to gar, spear, the connection lying in the shape of a spearhead. And when you have a good map to look at, you can see how the northern section of Lorien is shaped a bit like a spearhead, wider on the east, and kind of points down to the west. Well, I guess the west. Now we get into the blindfolding here. Haldir interestingly states the agreement was made to blindfold Gimli. If we look a few pages back, there was no real agreement made. Haldir just said he would have to go blindfolded, and then talked about the sleeping arrangements and told Legolas to keep an eye on the dwarf. But why is this such an issue? Well, I'll tell you. First, Nerd of the Rings did release a video relatively recently about why dwarves and elves hate each other. I'll put that in the description, for you to check out afterwards. He goes into more depth in that video than I will here, because, it's a whole video about it. But a couple things to quickly go over. I would say there are probably 3 main reasons. First, when Aule made the dwarves in secret, and Eru decided to give them their own agency, but said this: "When the time comes, I will awaken them, and they shall be to thee as children. And often strife shall arise between thine and mine, the children of my adoption and the children of my choice." So it was basically foretold, or I guess you could say ordained by Eru. So I guess it's pretty hard to argue with that. Secondly, I think the dwarves have a bit of a group memory of first meetings with the elves. The petty dwarves were initially hunted by the Noldor in some versions of the Legendarium because the Noldor didn't realize they were anything other than creatures like a deer or whatever. And when the Noldor met the regular dwarves, they named them Naugrim, or stunted people, because they were short. Similarly, they named men the sickly. The Noldor just weren't really great at endearing people by names. One of the biggest reasons the elves and dwarves have such enmity towards each other is due to Menegroth in Doriath. Once Thingol obtained a silmaril from Beren, he commissioned a necklace from the dwarves to showcase the silmaril, the Nauglamir. The dwarves wanted it back, seeing as only as like a lease and anything they made was always theirs. They then attacked Menegroth, killing most of the elves there and stealing the Nauglamir. Beren got it back by killing the whole group that left Doriath. Yes, I know that is a vast oversimplification, and if anybody is watching Corey Olsen going through, not the Ring of Mornoth, the War of the Jewels, that's it. He talks about this a little bit too, and where the Nauglamir came from. I know, very simplified, but we'll just go with that. It's kind of the basic structure. But not only is this a general, oh, they killed the Great King a really long time ago, so I still hate them, but it's pretty personal for Celeborn. Celeborn was the grandnephew of King Thingol and was there defending Doriath when the dwarves attacked. It's a deeply personal thing for Celeborn. So the dwarves get blindfolded because he doesn't want another attack, which we can tell kind of ridiculous because the elves in Lorien haven't dealt with dwarves in who knows how long, and I really doubt they have any super awesome necklaces there that the dwarves made. Luckily, Aragorn is there to kind of shut everybody up. He comes up with the classic compromise and no one is happy. They just all wear blindfolds. The ridiculousness of the situation is given thought here by Legolas and Haldir. Alas for the folly of these days, said Legolas. Here all are enemies of the one enemy, and yet I must walk blind while the sun is merry in the woodland under leaves of gold. Folly it may seem, said Haldir. Indeed, in nothing is the power of the Dark Lord more clearly shown than in the estrangement that divides all those who still oppose him. Yet so little faith and trust do we find now in the world beyond Lothlorien, unless maybe in Rivendell, that we dare not by our own trust endanger our lands. We live now upon an island amid many perils, and our hands are more often upon the bowstring than upon the harp. This contrasts with the talk in Counts of Elrond about folly being their cloak. That conversation is how Sauron would view what they're doing and using that against him. Here, they see how it can be folly because they're all on the same side. There's no trickery here. It's just people on the same side treating each other like the enemy. The silver lining, I guess, is Haldir does recognize it as folly, even though he sees the benefit of being extra careful. Now, as the company entertained folly, they crossed the Silverlode, and we get an interesting observation from Frodo here. As soon as he set foot upon the far bank of Silverlode, a strange feeling had come upon him, and it deepened as he walked on into the Nath. It seemed to him that he had stepped over a bridge of time into the corner of the elder days, and was now walking in a world that was no more. In Rivendell, there was memory of ancient things. In Lorien, the ancient things still lived on in the waking world. Evil had been seen and heard there. Sorrow had been known. The elves feared and distrusted the world outside. Wolves were howling on the wood's borders, but on the land of Lorien, no shadow lay. So Frodo is blindfolded, reminder, and his other senses were sharpened. I would say his spiritual senses are even sharpened as well. And what I think he's sensing is the working of Nenya, Galadriel's ring of power, like working. We are told in the Silmarillion that Galadriel longed for a kingdom to rule herself. She lived in Doriath with Celeborn, at least according to some of the writings of Tolkien, and she learned a lot from Melian. This is almost like how I said Frodo has, in a manner of speaking anyway, the effect on him of seeing the trees of Valinor because he holds the ring. Galadriel learned from a Maya, Melian, and so what she created with the power she obtained, Nenya, is not simply remembering the ancient things, but kind of keeping them alive. You could say Melian imprinted some of her power onto Galadriel, and that's what Galadriel is carrying forward and what Frodo is perceiving here. He's sensing the power and knowledge Galadriel gleaned from Melian that Galadriel is perpetuating through Nenya by creating the kingdom of the Lothlorien. It's her own personal Doriath. Eventually they received word they can take off their blindfolds. Of course, we get wonderfully beautiful prose describing what they're seeing because Tolkien loved his nature. Incidentally, this is where Sam gets the name for his first daughter. We also get a pretty interesting observation from Sam here. "It's sunlight and bright day right enough," he said. "I thought that elves were all for moon and stars, but this is more elvish than anything I ever heard tell of. I feel as if I was inside of a song, if you take my meaning." Here I think we have another person in the company unfamiliar with the true nature of Lothlorien, having the truth revealed to him. And like Frodo, I think he perceives the working of Nenya and the history like Galadhrim kind of carries with her. In Rivendell, they heard songs about Valinor, which Galadhrim herself saw and lived in. He surely heard the song of Baron One Hand, whom I think Galadhrim probably met at some point. We've already mentioned Galadhrim hanging out with Amaya, but here we see the difference between Sam and Frodo. Sam is thinking more about story, not history. And that's something we'll see more later, much later in the book. Frodo is concerned with doing the job while Sam continually refers back to the stories and how they're living the same long story they used to listen to around the fire with Bilbo. And standing on Cerin Amroth here, Frodo is brought back to reality pretty quickly. Frodo looked and saw, still at some distance, a hill of many mighty trees, or a city of green towers. Which it was he could not tell. Out of it, it seemed to him that the power and light came that held all the land in sway. He longed suddenly to fly like a bird to rest in the green city. Then he looked eastward and saw all the land of Lorien running down to the pale gleam of Anduin, the great river. He lifted his eyes across the river and all the light went out. He was back again in the world he knew. Beyond the river, the land appeared flat and empty, formless and vague, until far away it rose again like a wall, dark and drear. The sun that lay on Lothlorien had no power to enlighten the shadow of that distant height. Frodo sees the limit of the power of Galadhrim and Lorien. He goes very quickly from longing to fly like a bird to experience the beauty in front of him to the light going out and the sun having no power to reach the land. It's dreary, depressing, and it forebodes the rest of his journey too, which is, again, pretty depressing. But it does give us a little foreshadow of the rest the company will be getting when they come to Caras Galadhrim. As Frodo reached the bottom of the hill, we learn a little more about Aragorn. At the hill's foot, Frodo found Aragorn, standing still and silent as a tree. But in his hand was a small golden bloom of Eleanor, and a light was in his eyes. He was wrapped in some fair memory, and as Frodo looked at him, he knew that he beheld things as they once had been in this same place. For the grim years were removed from the face of Aragorn, and he seemed clothed in white, a young lord, tall and fair, and he spoke words in the Elvish tongue to one whom Frodo could not see. "Arwen, Vanimelda, Namarie," he said. And then he drew a breath, and returning out of his thought, he looked at Frodo and smiled. "Here is the heart of Elvendom on earth," he said, "and here my heart dwells ever, unless there be a light beyond the dark roads that we still must tread, you and I. Come with me." And taking Frodo's hand in his, he left the hill of Cerin Amroth and came there never again as a living man. Here Aragorn shows the biggest difference between men and elves. Men know not what happens after they die, not even whether they are tied to Arda the same way the elves are. He acknowledges this with such hope, in my opinion. He knows Eru will complete the workings of Arda and that whatever is in store for the future still has the possibility of being better than like his heaven on earth. But we also see the courage and the determination of Aragorn in the very last line. He left the hill. He started his journey away from where his heart dwells, where he met his wife. But he has a job to do, prophecy to fulfill, a country to bring back from the brink. And leaving that hill where he met his wife, he came there never again as a living man. And with that, we come to the end of chapter 6, Lothlorien. Thank you all so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, join the channel membership, and until next time, always remember, Aude and Tulip, day shall come again.